Some power lurks behind badges, some behind a steady gaze that doesn't waver under pressure. On a desolate stretch of Colorado highway, where the road cuts through jagged foothills like a scar, two cops flagged down a solitary woman expecting her to fold under their authority. She seemed ordinary, calm voice, no flash of wealth or status, no credentials in view to hint at her importance. But Eleanor Harper wasn't just another traveler passing through the quiet county. They slipped drugs into her trunk with the ease of a practiced routine, smirked as they slapped on cuffs tight enough to bruise, and hauled her to the precinct on a trumped-up charge that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. To them, it was routine, another notch on their belts, another story they'd laugh about over beers. Within hours, their grins would fade into something closer to fear. Eleanor was the DEA's director, a name that carried weight in rooms they'd never enter. And by targeting her, they didn't just slip up. They split open the corrupt system that had shielded them for years, a system that thrived on silence and complicity. Before we dive deeper into this unraveling, drop a comment with where you're reading from, I'd love to know, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Dawn clung to the Colorado foothills. Like a reluctant guest, the air so still it seemed to hold its breath, heavy with the kind of quiet that made every sound feel sharper. A faint haze drifted over the blacktop, softening the edges of pine trees lining the road, their branches sagging under the weight of last night's rain. Eleanor Harper steered her silver sedan through the winding curves, the tires humming softly against the slick pavement. Her window was down just enough to let in the sharp, clean scent of wet pine and fresh asphalt, a mix that felt grounding after days of breathing recycled DC air. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the road glistening under a sky too stubborn to clear, gray clouds hanging low like a lid over the world. She dressed low-key, gray hoodie zipped halfway, dark jeans that had seen better days, hair tied back in a loose ponytail, no badge, no escort, nothing to mark her as anything more than a civilian heading home. Her phone sat idle in the cup holder next to her coffee, untouched since she'd left her brother's place that morning, the screen dark except for the faint glow of a low battery warning. The weekend had been a rare break from the relentless pace of Washington. 3 days of family chaos, the kind that felt like a warm embrace after months of cold bureaucracy. She'd spent it surrounded by the comforting noise of her brother's house, kids scribbling homework at the kitchen table, pencils scratching against paper, the clatter of dishes in the sink, and late-night laughs with her nephew overboard. Games and warm apple pie, the kind you don't find in city shops, its crust flaky and golden, the filling tart with a hint of cinnamon. Out here, her title didn't matter, stripped away by the simplicity of being Aunt Ellie, pitching in with dishes, humming to classic rock in socks that skidded on polished hardwood floors, her movements easy, her laughter genuine. The highway, stretched quiet, no cars in sight, just the endless ribbon of pavement cutting through the rugged landscape, flanked by rocky slopes on one side and dense forest on the other. Eleanor glanced at her dashboard. No alerts, no calls, just the slow fade of a weekend winding down, the clock ticking toward the inevitable return to her desk in D.C. Her fingers drummed the wheel to a low Springsteen riff pulsing from the speakers. The song's gravelly voice, a quiet companion, loud enough to fill the silence, but not so much that it drowned out her thoughts. Then she caught it, a cruiser's grille glinting in her rear view, tailing too close, too steady to be passing through on a routine patrol. At first, she figured it might overtake, just a county deputy cruising a sleepy stretch on a Monday morning, looking for something to do. But it didn't. It stuck to her, mirroring her speed, deliberate, like a predator pacing its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. She eased off the gas, clocking 43 in a 45, her eyes flicking between the road and the mirror, and signaled to pull over, giving them room to pass if that's what they wanted. They didn't budge, staying right in her lane, their presence a weight she could feel in her chest. When the lights flared, it was without fanfare, no siren to break the stillness, just a cold, methodical flash of red and blue demanding she stop. the colors cutting through the gray morning like a warning she couldn't ignore. She guided the sedan to the gravel shoulder, the crunch of rocks under her tires loud in the quiet, her signal still ticking rhythmically as the engine fell. Silent, hands on the wheel, back straight, eyes ahead, she stayed composed, her breathing even despite the tension creeping up her spine. This wasn't her first stop, not by a long shot, and she knew the drill. Stay polite, stay calm, stay sharp, because any misstep could escalate things in ways she'd seen too often in reports that crossed her desk. Still, a knot tightened in her gut as the officers approached. One at her window, his boots crunching gravel with deliberate steps, the other circling to her blind spot by the trunk, his shadow moving just out of sight. The one at her side, a weathered guy with a chiseled jaw and sun-creased skin that spoke of years under harsh sunlight, rapped on the glass twice with his knuckles, firm, expectant. The sound sharp enough to make her shoulders tense for a split second. She rolled the window halfway, face neutral, voice even, her words measured like someone who knew the stakes of every syllable. "Morning, officer. Why'd you pull me over? I wasn't speeding." He didn't bite, didn't even acknowledge her question. Instead, he tilted his head, sizing her up with a slow, deliberate gaze, eyes flicking to her hands, still planted firmly on the wheel, then back to her face, searching for something. Fear, maybe, or defiance. "License and registration," he said, his tone flat, laced with a subtle edge, like he was daring her to push back. His words clipped and cold, the kind of voice that expected compliance without question. "Routine stop. You were weaving a bit back there. Could have been a hazard." "I didn't notice any weaving," she said, her voice steady, factual, not a hint of challenge in it. "But I'll grab the documents for you." Her movements were slow, precise, reaching for the glove box with her right hand to pull out the registration, the paper crisp and neatly folded, then her wallet for her ID, her fingers steady despite the weight of their stares. Every gesture was calculated, practiced, a routine born from years of knowing that control could mean safety, that any sudden move could be misread as a threat. She handed over the papers, the license and registration passing from her hand to his with a quiet rustle, and the officer scanned her license, his brow creasing as he read the name, his thumb brushing over the edge of the card as if testing its authenticity. "Harper," he muttered, almost to himself, his voice low, gruff, the word hanging in the air like a question he wasn't ready to ask. He glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You in town visiting, Ms. Harper?" "Don't see many DC plates out this way." "Yep," she said, keeping it short, her tone neutral, not offering more than what was asked, knowing better than to volunteer anything that could be twisted against her. He held her ID longer than needed, his fingers lingering on the card, his gaze flicking between her face and the license, as if trying to match the woman in front of him with the information in his hand. Then he gave a slight nod to his partner, a subtle tilt of his head that spoke of a shared understanding, a silent signal that made Eleanor's gut tighten further. "Open the trunk," he said, his voice dropping lower, the command clear, "No. Room for negotiation." Eleanor stayed still, her hands unmoving on the wheel, her posture unchanged. "Is that an order, or are you asking?" she said, her voice calm but pointed, her words careful, testing the boundaries of their authority, knowing she had every right to question a search without cause. The second officer, younger, stocky, with a sharp glint in his eyes that spoke of a mean streak, stepped closer to the trunk, arms crossed over his broad chest, his posture aggressive, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he shifted his weight. "Got something back there we should know about, ma'am?" he asked, his tone baiting, the words dripping with mock suspicion, his voice loud enough to carry over the quiet hum of the highway, his hand resting casually near the baton on his belt. "I know exactly what's in my trunk," she said, her voice steady, her gaze flicking to the rearview mirror to catch his reflection. "I'd like to know why you feel the need to search it. What's your probable cause?" "Ma'am, let's not make this difficult," the first officer said, still clutching her ID, his grip tightening on the card, his knuckles whitening slightly. Do it now, or we'll do it for you, and I promise you won't like that option." His voice was low, a warning wrapped in a veneer of professionalism that was starting to crack. A beat passed, the air thick with tension, the sound of a distant crow cawing in the pines the only break in the silence. Eleanor hit the trunk release under the dash, her finger pressing the button with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. The trunk popped open, the lid easing up with a faint creak, revealing the contents to the officer behind her. The younger officer moved to inspect it, his footsteps heavy on the gravel, out of her sight, leaving her with nothing but the sound of his movements and the weight of the older officer's stare. She sat motionless, staring forward through the windshield, her hand still on the wheel, her breathing slow and deliberate as the older officer lingered by her window, his face a mask of indifference, his eyes unreadable behind the tint of his sunglasses. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, the kind that made every second feel like a minute. Then the younger one returned, his boots crunching back toward her window, holding a small plastic bag, the kind used for evidence, filled with white powder, the contents catching the faint light filtering through the clouds. "Well, look here," he said, dangling it in her view, his voice smug, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess this slipped your mind when you were packing, huh?" Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't let her expression shift even a fraction, her eyes locked on the bag, then flicking to the officer's face. "That's not mine," she said, her voice calm, factual, the words carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You sure about that?" The older officer leaned in closer, his breath sour with the faint tang of chewing tobacco, his voice low, menacing, his face close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw. "Out here, lady. You're not calling the shots. Keep mouthing off, and this gets real ugly, real fast." Eleanor turned to him slowly, her eyes steady, unflinching, her voice unshaken, each word deliberate and clear. "I'm invoking my rights. I don't consent to this search, and I want a lawyer. That bag wasn't in my car, and you know it. This is a false accusation, and I'm documenting every step of this interaction." The older officer's lip curled, a half smirk, half sneer that spoke of disdain, his hand tightening on her ID as if he could crush her defiance with his grip. "Now she's a lawyer," he said, glancing at his partner, his voice dripping with mockery, his eyes glinting with something darker, anger maybe, or amusement at her expense. "Hear that, Jake? We've got ourselves a legal expert." "Sounds like a guilty one to me," Jake shot back, his laugh short, brittle, betraying the tension coiling beneath the surface. His hand still holding the bag, his fingers tightening around it as if to emphasize his point. "Innocent folks don't talk this much, do they? They don't get all high and mighty about their rights." "I'm not guilty," Eleanor said, her gaze locked on them, her voice level, her eyes moving. Between the two men, taking in every detail, the way Jake's jaw twitched, the way the older officer's hand hovered near his holster. "If you believed your own story, you wouldn't need to taunt me to sell it. You know this is illegal, and so do I. You're crossing a line, and you're doing it on purpose." The older officer stepped closer, his shadow heavy over her, his presence looming like a storm cloud ready to break. "That attitude of yours," he growled, jaw tight, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down, taking in her calm, her control, as if it were a personal insult. "Keep it up, and we'll tack on obstruction. You think you're hot stuff, Ms. Harper, but out here, a badge means you do what you're told. No questions, no backtalk." Eleanor didn't budge, didn't blink, her hand steady on the wheel, her posture unyielding despite the pressure building in the air. "Then follow your own rules and get a supervisor out here," she said, her voice firm but controlled, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Anything else is a violation of your own department's policy, and you know it. I'm not moving until you do things by the book." The air crackled with unspoken threats, the moment hanging, like a frayed wire ready to snap. The older officer's face darkened, the pretense of civility gone, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscle twitch under his skin. "Get out of the car," he said, voice low, hard, the words a command, not a request, his hand already reaching for the door handle. "No," she said, firm but controlled, her voice unwavering, her eyes locked on his, refusing to back down even as her heart pounded in her chest. "Not without a supervisor. You've got no grounds to search me, no cause to arrest me, and that bag's a plant. I'm not complying with an unlawful order." That broke the act entirely. The older officer reached in, hit the door lock with a sharp click, and yanked it open, the hinges groaning as he grabbed her arm with a grip meant to dominate, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. Jake moved fast, unbuckling her seatbelt with a jerk, pulling her out with a force that made her shoulder ache, his hands rough and unyielding. Their movements were practiced, a routine they'd run before, a choreography of intimidation they'd perfected over years of exploiting their power. They didn't read her rights, didn't list charges, didn't log the bag as evidence. They didn't follow any of the procedures they were sworn to uphold. They hauled her from the seat like she was a lesson to be taught, a message to anyone who dared question their authority. Her boots hit the gravel hard, the impact jarring her knees as they marched her to the rear of her car, their grips tight, their steps purposeful. Her wrists were jerked back with a roughness that spoke of anger, not necessity, the cuffs snapping tight, digging into her skin. Not for safety, but to prove a point, the metal cold and biting, the click of the ratchets echoing in the still, morning air. She didn't fight, but she didn't cower either, her back staying straight, her head high, her voice clear despite the pain shooting up her arms. "This is illegal," she said, her words steady, cutting through the tension. Her voice carrying a quiet authority that made their silence feel heavier. "I've complied with every lawful order, posed no threat, offered no resistance, and that bag wasn't mine. I want your badge numbers and your supervisor's name, and I want them now." They didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge her. Words, their silence cold, deliberate, a wall meant to shut her down. They shoved her toward the cruiser, their hands on her shoulders, pushing her forward with an indifference that felt practiced, their boots kicking up dust as they walked. Passing cars slowed, drivers glancing at what looked like a standard arrest, a woman in cuffs, flanked by cops the public trusted, the kind of scene that played out every day without question. No one knew her. No one knew the truth of what was happening. That invisibility was their weapon, a shield that let them act without consequence, and her danger, a vulnerability that made every second feel like a gamble. Jake opened the cruiser's rear door with a rough jerk, the hinges creaking, gesturing for her to get in with a tilt of his head, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. She didn't argue, didn't waste her breath on protests that would fall on deaf ears. She ducked and slid onto the hard plastic seat, the cuffs biting her wrists as she sat, her posture rigid, the molded surface unyielding against her back. The door slammed shut, heavy, final, the sound echoing in the cramped space, the lock clicking into place like a punctuation mark on their control. Through the glass, scratched and smudged with years of use, she watched them move to the front of the cruiser, their movements casual now, their shoulders relaxed as if the hard part was over. The older officer grabbed his radio, his voice calm, professional, the kind of tone he might use for a minor report, as if this were just another day on the job. "Unit 19, we're 10-15, one female, narcotics possession, resisting search," he said, the words clipped, routine, each one a lie that would become official record. Every word was a fabrication, a story they'd crafted to cover their tracks. Her name wasn't logged in the system yet. The drug wasn't tested, wasn't even processed as evidence. There was no resistance, no struggle, no reason for the escalation they'd forced. But it was recorded now, fiction turned fact in a system that rarely questioned the narrative, especially for someone like her, someone who fit the profile they'd targeted so many times before. The ride to the station was silent, broken only by the crackle of radio static and the drone of tires on wet pavement, the cruiser's shocks creaking as they hit potholes in the road. Eleanor sat still, her body tense, but her mind sharp, not asking questions, not begging for mercy or reconsideration. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, a calculated stillness that let her observe, think, plan. She cataloged everything, their names, etched on their badges, Daniels and Brooks. The cruiser's ID number stenciled on the dashboard, the route they took, winding through back roads lined with sagging fences and overgrown fields. The exact moment they escalated without cause, the way Daniels's hand had lingered on his holster, the way Brooks had smirked when he held up the bag. By the time they reached the station's back entrance, a nondescript door tucked behind a row of overflowing dumpsters, she'd memorized every detail, stored like evidence behind her eyes, a mental vault she'd built over years of navigating systems that weren't always just. Justice might not come, might not even be possible in a place like this. But if it did, if there was even a chance, she'd be ready to meet it with everything she had. The older officer, Daniels, pulled her out of the cruiser, his grip firm but no longer taunting, his fingers digging into her arm just enough to remind her who was in control. They entered through the side door into a dim hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting harsh shadows on the scuffed tile floors, the walls stained with years of neglect, peeling paint curling at the edges. The air reeked of old coffee and bleach, a stale mix that clung to the back of her throat, a lone fan rattling by a barred window, its blades caked with dust, barely stirring the heavy air. At the booking desk, a scratched wooden counter littered with crumpled papers and empty styrofoam cups. The sergeant looked up, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of monotony, grabbing a clipboard with a bored routine that spoke of countless arrests processed without thought. "Possession and obstruction," Daniels said, passing her off with a shove that made her stumble slightly, his voice flat, as if the words were just another box to check. The sergeant glanced at her, his eyes dull, taking in her cuffs, her calm demeanor, then took her ID from Daniels's hand, the card smudged with the officer's fingerprints. Name: Eleanor Harper. He typed lazily, his fingers moving over the keyboard with a slow mechanical rhythm, his eyes flicking between her and the screen, expecting another standard case, another name to log and forget. His fingers slowed as the screen loaded, the faint hum of the computer the only sound in the room. He blinked, leaned forward, squinting at the text, his jaw pausing mid-chew, like he'd swallowed a word that wouldn't go down. He typed faster, pulling up another database, one with a secure border, the kind that required clearance most small-town stations didn't have. His face lost its casual ease, the color draining from his cheeks as the screen flickered with new information. "Hang on," he mumbled, not to her, not to the officers, but to himself. His voice barely above a whisper, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the mouse. He looked at her again, really looked, taking in her calm, her control, the way she hadn't panicked, hadn't begged or cried when they shoved her through the door. She wasn't acting like a suspect, wasn't breaking under the weight of the cuffs or the accusations. She was watching, waiting, her gaze steady, her posture unyielding, like someone who knew something they didn't. "You said Harper?" he asked, voice quieter now. The boredom replaced with a creeping unease, his eyes flicking back to the screen as if hoping he'd misread. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, her tone giving nothing away. Her eyes locked on his, watching the realization dawn. He stared at the screen, hand hovering over the keys, frozen for a moment, then grabbed the phone, his movements jerky, his fingers fumbling with the receiver. "What's the problem?" Daniel snapped, annoyed by the delay, his voice sharp, his patience fraying as the sergeant's hesitation stretched the silence. The sergeant didn't reply, didn't even look at him, his focus on the call he was making. He dialed an internal line, speaking low, his words too quiet to catch, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, now pale, tense, his free hand gripping the edge of the desk as if to steady himself. He hung up, turned to the officers, and pointed down the hall, his voice tight, urgent. "Both of you, conference room now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, his eyes darting between them, a sheen of sweat forming on his brow. The officers exchanged a look, a flicker of confusion passing between them, their confidence wavering for the first time since the stop. Jake, just arriving behind them, expected a quick handover, maybe a pat on the back for a job well done, his smirk still lingering from the arrest. The sergeant's tone threw him off, his steps faltering as he followed Daniels down the hall. "What's up?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the bravado fading as they glanced back at Eleanor, their shoulders tense, their steps heavier, like they could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Eleanor watched, noting their tension, the way Daniels's hand twitched toward his radio, the way Brooks' eyes darted back to her, a flicker of unease breaking through his mask of control. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, the sound echoing down the hall. The sergeant returned to the desk, uncuffing her with shaky hands, his fingers fumbling with the key, the metal clinking as he worked to free her wrists. "Ma'am, I need your phone," he said, his voice low, his eyes avoiding hers, his hands trembling as he held out a plastic bag for her to place it in. She handed it over without hesitation, her movements calm, deliberate, her voice steady as she spoke. "We're logging it as property," he said, his tone mechanical, his hands still shaking as he sealed the bag, scribbling a quick note on the label. "You'll get it back when this is sorted." "I want to make a call," she said, her voice firm, her eyes locked on his, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. He nodded, silent, logging the phone, re-entering her name into the system, his fingers moving faster now, as if trying to outrun the panic rising in his chest. The system chimed. A sharp red alert flashed on the screen, not a local ping, but a federal warning, the kind that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. Her photo loaded, not a driver's license snapshot, but a federal portrait, the kind taken for official records, her face serious, her title unmistakable. The text read, "Harper, Eleanor, Director, Drug Enforcement Administration. Classified access level 5. Immediate federal contact required." The sergeant froze, mouth open, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes widening as the reality hit him like a freight train. He looked at her, panic rising, his face pale, his hands trembling as he set the phone down, his movements clumsy, the receiver clattering against the desk. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking, "we didn't know who you were. I'm getting someone on the line right now, I swear." "You'll do more than that," Eleanor said, her voice low, cutting through his panic like a blade, her tone sharp, authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded attention even in a whisper. "Lock this place down immediately. Freeze all access, internal and external. Seal every surveillance log, block every access card, secure the custody desk, and make sure nothing moves in or out. This building's under federal hold as of this moment. I'm launching a DEA investigation, and I need a secure line in 60 seconds, no excuses." "Yes, Director," he said, tripping over the title, the word sounding foreign in his mouth as he grabbed the phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it, his voice cracking as he dialed. Eleanor didn't wait for permission, didn't need it. She moved to a secure terminal in the corner of the room, her steps purposeful, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she entered her override codes, the screen lighting up with encrypted channels only someone with her clearance could access. The room went quiet, the sergeant's frantic movements the only sound, his breathing ragged as he followed her orders, his eyes darting to her every few seconds, as if expecting her to vanish, or worse, to turn her authority on him next. "Agent." Daniel Torres' voice crackled through the secure line, his tone sharp, professional, but laced with concern. Director Harper, what's your status? Yes, she said, her voice steady, her words clipped, wasting no time on pleasantries. I'm detained on false charges by 2 officers in Clearwater County Precinct. I've initiated a lockdown and need an emergency team for physical security, data extraction, and evidence review. This is a priority 1 situation. A beat of silence on the other end, the faint sound of Torres's breathing as he processed her words. Are you okay? Any injuries? Unhurt, she said, her tone factual, her mind already moving to the next step. The officers bolted the second my ID hit the system. They're gone, not in the building, likely not even in the county by now. This wasn't random, Daniel. The drugs they planted were federal grade, likely from a seizure, sealed in evidence-grade packaging. Someone's playing a bigger game here. Lock everything down, no exceptions. Got it, Torres said, his voice tightening with urgency, the sound of keys clacking in the background as he relayed orders. Teams en route. ETA, 40 minutes. Stay put and stay safe. She hung up, the click of the receiver loud in the quiet room, turning to the sergeant, her eyes sharp, her voice unyielding. Monitor every exit, starting now. Check all cruisers logged in the last 3 hours, entry and exit times, driver names, everything. Pull the last 15 minutes of internal video, back it up to an external drive. No edits, no deletions, I want it raw. Their cruiser's not out front. Find its last known spot, check the logs, check the cameras. They didn't walk out of here. That vehicle either swapped plates or was dumped somewhere close. Issue a DEA alert under my authority and flag the vehicle as missing countywide, statewide if needed. He grabbed the radio, his voice unsteady but moving, his hands shaking as he relayed her orders, his words tripping over each other in his haste to comply. A siren blipped somewhere inside the building, a rare emergency signal, sharp and piercing, the kind that made officers stop mid-step, their heads turning toward the sound. Across the county, the precinct would be marked, restricted, a red flag in every system, a warning to every cop on duty. Other stations would swarm, not to defend their own, but to ask questions that would crack open old cases, dig up buried reports, expose the rot that had been festering for years. Eleanor stood by the desk, uncuffed, her wrists red from the cuffs, but her posture unyielding, her authority absolute, a force that filled the room despite her quiet. They hadn't known her when they stopped her, hadn't known the power behind the name on her ID. They did now, and the weight of that realization was spreading through the precinct like wildfire. And whoever helped those men vanish, whoever supplied that drugs, whoever ran the game behind closed doors, whoever thought they could use her as a pawn, they would learn the hard way too. She wasn't here to clear her name, to walk away and let this slide. She was here to dismantle theirs, to rip their world apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hide behind. The evidence room felt like a freezer, stark and sterile. The air so cold it bit at the skin, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh, unyielding glow over the rows of metal racks. The storage tech, a weary man in his 60s with smudged half-moon glasses perched on his nose, and a worn precinct shirt that hung loose on his frame, hovered by a rack where the cocaine bag was logged, his hands clutching a clipboard as if it were a lifeline. His hands shook as he handed the clipboard to Agent Torres, who'd arrived with the federal team 23 minutes after Eleanor's call, his boots echoing on the concrete floor as he crossed the room. The custody form's signature was fresh, the ink still slightly smudged, and it told a story that didn't match the arrest report, the discrepancies glaring under the harsh light. Torres read it, his face blank, his jaw tight, then passed it to Eleanor, his movements precise, his eyes flicking to hers with a silent question. The bag's tag number wasn't local, no precinct code, no standard inventory mark, just a federal trace linked to Operation Vanguard, a DEA sting that seized 400 kilos of cartel drugs 2 months ago in Denver, the kind of operation that made headlines, the drugs locked away in a secure vault in Virginia under round-the-clock surveillance. Or so they'd believed, so they'd been told. So the reports had claimed. Eleanor scanned the form, her eyes moving over the text, taking in every detail, the tag number, the date, the seal's serial code, the faint smudge of a fingerprint on the corner of the paper. The code was legit, cross-referenced with federal records she'd seen herself during the operation's debrief. The test packet attached to the pouch was real, the kind used in high-stakes cases, its results stamped and verified, but its presence in her trunk, planted by two low-level county cops with no clearance to even know about Vanguard, let alone access its evidence, meant someone had cracked federal security, bypassed every safeguard, and pulled it back into play. Not to sell on the street, but to frame someone who'd never see it coming. Her face stayed stone, her expression unreadable, her voice low as she spoke, the words heavy with implication. This was never in their custody. It shouldn't have left our vault in Virginia. Someone bypassed two clearance levels. Federal clearance, and faked the logs to cover the extraction. They had help, and they had a plan. Torres nodded, his eyes narrowing, his mind already racing through the possibilities, the implications of a breach this deep. They had access, they had time, and they knew no one would dig into it because they didn't expect a target like you, he said, his voice low, his words measured, his hands tightening around the clipboard as if he could crush the truth out of it. They thought they'd picked a nobody, someone who'd fold under the pressure, someone they could bury in the system. She returned the clipboard to the tech, her movements deliberate, her eyes flicking to his trembling hands. His pale face, the way he wouldn't meet her gaze. "This place is a federal crime scene now," she said, her voice firm, her tone leaving no room for argument, her words echoing in the cold room. "Lock every room, seal every cabinet, and I want a full manifest of everything logged in the last 30 days. Dates, times, names, chain of custody, everything. If anything's missing, if even one item is unaccounted for, I want to know when it disappeared and who signed it out. No exceptions." The tech swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, his glasses slipping down his nose as he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper as he muttered, "Yes, ma'am," before turning to make a hushed call, his hands still shaking as he dialed, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Outside, unease rippled through the precinct like a bad smell, spreading from officer to officer, a tension that hung in the air like smoke. Cops who'd scoffed at her arrest now stood rigid, their postures stiff, their eyes darting down hallways, their conversations hushed, their hands lingering near phones as if waiting for a call that could save them, or damn them. No announcement came, no loudspeaker crackling with orders, but the truth landed hard, etched in every nervous glance, every cleared throat, every sidelong look. Internal Affairs rolled in within an hour, their arrival marked by the sharp click of heels on tile, led by Captain Laura Bennett in a sharp gray suit, her blazer tailored to a razor edge, her expression unreadable, flanked by two DOJ civil rights analysts in dark coats and an aide carrying a stack of laptops. Known for cutting through noise, for seeing through lies, Bennett skipped pleasantries, her voice low and direct as she issued orders, her team moving with precision, grabbing digital logs, grilling officers, locking down terminals, their presence, a silent promise of accountability. The local chief, Thomas Reed, with a long face and thinning hair combed tight to preserve what little authority he had left, tried to take charge. His steps hurried as he approached Eleanor by the ops board, a wall of maps and files that laid bare the precinct's sins. His sweater was damp with sweat, the fabric clinging to his shoulders. His face flushed as he extended a hand she ignored, his voice strained with forced confidence. "Director Harper," he said, his tone overly formal, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air before he dropped it. "This is a mix-up, a misunderstanding. Daniels and Brooks are good men, some of our best. We run a clean operation here, always have." Eleanor fixed him with a look, her eyes steady, unreadable, her voice low, cutting through his bluster like a knife through paper. "You didn't." No two officers pulled cartel-grade drugs from a federal locker, used them to frame me, and vanished before you even knew my name? She said, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet anger that made the air feel heavier, her gaze pinning him in place. Reed's mouth twitched, voiceless, his eyes darting to the side as if looking for an escape, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. "They've never raised flags with me," he said, his voice weaker now, his confidence crumbling under her scrutiny. "Years of awards, high-clearance patrols, solid files, commendations from the state even." "Too solid," Torres cut. In stepping forward, his voice hard, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Reed. "Their stops hit minorities, mostly, in rural spots. No body cams, no oversight. Complaints were filed, dozens of them, but there's no video, no follow-up, no accountability. You're telling me you never noticed?" Reed wiped his neck, sweating harder, his hand leaving a damp smear on his collar, his voice faltering as he spoke. "We're stretched thin out here," he said, his words sounding more like an excuse than an explanation, his eyes flicking to the floor, unable to meet theirs. "Things slip sometimes. Paperwork, protocols, you know how it is." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice clear, her presence commanding, her words cutting through his excuses with surgical precision. "What's slipping isn't procedure, it's integrity," she said, her tone low, her eyes locked on his, watching the way he flinched under her gaze. "If you didn't know they played you, made a fool of you under your own roof, or you were too cozy, too comfortable to care, too busy collecting your own commendations to notice the rot. Which is it, Chief? Because either way, you failed." Before he could answer, before he could stammer out another excuse, Torres's phone pinged, the sound sharp in the tense silence, cutting through the moment like a blade. He stepped aside, his brow furrowing as he read the message, returning with a blurry convenience store camera still from near the county line, the timestamp fresh, the image grainy but clear enough to make out the details. It showed Daniels and Brooks climbing from their cruiser into a black SUV, the plates visible, registered to a name that made Eleanor's eyes narrow. Victor Miles. She studied the image, her mind racing, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper as she committed the details to memory. "That name ring a bell?" she asked, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet intensity, her eyes flicking to Torres. "It should," Torres said, his voice grim, his jaw tightening as he handed her the printout, his fingers lingering on the paper for a moment. Victor Miles was a Nevada narcotics officer, supposedly killed in a car fire 2 years back. Burned so bad they ID'd him by dental records. "Guess he's not so dead after all," Eleanor said, checking the timestamp, her mind already piecing together the implications, the connections forming like a web in her head. She turned to Bennett, her voice sharp, her orders clear. "I want everything on Miles. Records, associates, financials, everything. If he faked his death, he had backup, someone to pull the strings, someone with access. This isn't two guys acting alone. It's a web, a network, and we're pulling it apart." Bennett's face hardened, her jaw tightening, her eyes glinting with determination as she nodded, her voice low but firm. "On it," she said, turning to her team. Her orders clipped as they moved to comply, their laptops already open, their fingers flying over the keys. Next morning, in the precinct's secure meeting room, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over a table buried in arrest logs, case files, and digital printouts, the paper scattered like leaves after a storm. A wall screen mapped the Tri-County area, red dots marking every stop by Daniels and Brooks over 14 months, over 50 in total, with 32 resulting in charges, mostly against minorities, nearly all missing body cam footage, the pattern as clear as a neon sign. Eleanor stood, arms crossed, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the screen as Agent Sarah Wells, a tech expert with a sharp mind and sharper tongue, scrolled through the data, her fingers moving over the tablet with precision. Each dot glowed, stats streaming beside it. Reports, locations, times, names, outcomes. The data painting a picture of systemic abuse that couldn't be ignored. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was blatant, deliberate. A playbook written in the blood of those they'd targeted. "They picked their spots with care," Wells said, her voice sharp, her words clipped, her eyes flicking to Eleanor as she spoke. "Rural roads, no dash cams, no witnesses, always citing erratic driving as their excuse. Same wording across every report, word for word, like a script they memorized. No audits, no follow-ups, no accountability, nothing." Eleanor tapped a dot near the top left, her finger pressing against the screen, her voice low, her tone demanding answers. "What's this one? Pull it up." Wells clicked, her movements quick, efficient, a file loading on the screen with a faint beep. Michael Carter, 22, stopped for a busted taillight on a back road at dusk, found dead 2 hours after booking, ruled a suicide by the coroner's office. The room chilled, the air growing heavy, the silence pressing against their ears as the words sank in. Eleanor's face didn't shift, her expression unreadable, but her eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them as she read the file. "Pull everything, arrest report, intake forms, booking photos, video logs, whatever's in the system," she said, her voice low, her tone leaving no room for delay, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. 10 minutes later, Carter's file spread across the table, the papers scattered, the photos stark under the harsh light, grainy images of a young man with fear in his eyes, his face bruised, his shirt torn at the collar. No priors, no history of violence, no reason to be a threat. He'd called his daughter from the cell, the log showing a 3-minute call at 7:14 p.m., his voice scared but clear, promising he'd be home soon, telling her to finish her homework, to hug her mom for him. 90 minutes later, at 8:43 p.m., he was found hanged with a torn sheet in his cell, the report labeling him aggressive, unstable, a danger to himself, the words written with a carelessness that spoke of a cover-up. No cell photos, no inmate, statements, no body cam footage, just enough to bury the case, to close it without question, to make it disappear into the system's endless files. Torres frowned, his jaw tight, his fingers tracing the edge of the report as he read, his voice low, angry. "No suicide watch, no psych eval, no supervisor sign-off on the report. Nothing that should have been standard for a death in custody," he said, his words heavy, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, searching for her reaction. Bennett leaned in, her eyes narrowing, her voice cold, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "They killed him," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her gaze locked on the photo of Carter, his eyes staring back from the grainy printout. Eleanor lifted the booking. Form, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning the text, her voice low, her tone demanding answers. "Who signed this? Who logged him in?" Wells checked the digital record, her fingers flying over the tablet, her brow furrowing as she read. "Daniels, digitally signed at 7:02 p.m., right after the arrest," she said, her voice tight, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, the implication, "Clear." Eleanor signaled her aide, a young agent standing by the door pulling arrests from the last 18 months, her voice sharp, her orders clear. "Cross-check every in-custody death in this precinct, going back 2 years, she said, her tone unyielding, her eyes locked on the screen, watching as the data shifted. "Match them with undocumented family calls, anything off the books, texts, voicemails, anything that shows they reached out before they died." Wells paused, her fingers hovering over the tablet, her voice low, hesitant, as if she didn't want to add to the weight of the moment. "There's more," she said, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen as she opened a file. Carter bystander video, shaky footage from a parked car across the street from his arrest, posted on a community board but never logged. As evidence, The timestamp showing it had been uploaded 3 days after his death. It showed Daniels yanking Carter's collar, shouting in his face, his voice muffled but the anger clear, slamming him into the cruiser with a force that made the car rock. Brooks kneed his thigh, shoving him into the back seat, his movements rough, deliberate, a display of power meant to break. No urgency, just habit. A routine they'd perfected over years of targeting those who couldn't fight back. Eleanor replayed it, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing as she watched the footage loop, her voice low, her tone laced with anger. How'd this get missed? Why wasn't this in the case file? It didn't get missed, Wells said, her voice hard, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen, her fingers tightening around the tablet. It was buried. The post was flagged and wiped 3 weeks later. The account banned. The forum shut down under pressure. A rights group scraped it before it disappeared, saved it off-site, Bennett added, her voice cold, her words sharp, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. The coroner's report noted ligature marks around his neck, but no restraint injuries. No bruising, no scrapes, nothing to match the force in that video, she said, her tone laced with disgust, her eyes flicking to the photo of Carter, his face frozen in fear. It's a contradiction they didn't even bother to explain. They didn't expect a second look, Torres said, his voice low, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the screen, watching the footage loop again, the violence playing out in grainy detail. They wrote it to slide through, to close the case, before anyone could ask questions. Eleanor leaned on the table, her hands pressing against the wood, her eyes sweeping over the files, the photos, the reports, her voice low, her tone heavy with realization. This isn't a mistake, not a one-off, she said, her words slow, deliberate, each one landing like a stone. It's a system, a machine built to protect the hunters, not the hunted. They didn't just target people, they hunted them, picked them out, broke them, erased them. Wells opened another file, her fingers moving quickly, her voice tight as she spoke. Some drugs were logged in their cases, others vanished without a trace, she said, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen, the data streaming in front of her. One case lists a kilo of powder seized during a stop, but it's not in storage, not in the property room, not anywhere in the system. Eleanor glanced at Torres, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with determination. If it's missing, it was either sold on the street or planted in another setup, just like they did with me, she said, her words heavy, her mind already racing through the possibilities, the implications of a pattern this deep. Check. Every item Daniels or Brooks logged in the last year, cross-reference with seizures, arrests, everything. I want to know where it went. Bennett nodded, her jaw tightening, her voice firm, her orders clear. We reopen Carter's case, file for DOJ oversight, exhume the body if we have to, subpoena the officers who signed off on the suicide claim, she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her eyes glinting with determination as she turned to her team, her orders already being relayed. They moved fast. Their movements urgent, their focus razor-sharp, building a case bigger than one death, bigger than one precinct, a machine that shielded predators, erased their crimes, signed for their silence, a system that had been running unchecked for years. 2 days later, a secure DOJ call hit Bennett's inbox, no signature attached. The metadata scrambled through proxies, the kind of encryption that spoke of someone who knew how to disappear. The voice on the line was tense, low, the words rushed, as if the speaker was looking over their shoulder, expecting to be caught at any moment. They've been in 5 departments in 10 years, moving like ghosts. Every move, every transfer, a seizure gets compromised, mislogged, lost, or resold on the street. Check Pine Creek, Jefferson County, Marlin Springs, Marlowe County, Lorton Ridge. You'll find the same pattern, the same cleanup, the same bodies buried in paperwork. I'm not giving my name, not over this line, not ever. If they know I talked, I'm done. My family's done. You don't know what they're capable of. Bennett verified the data, her team working through the night, pulling records, cross-referencing names, dates, locations, their laptops glowing in the dark conference room. Daniels and Brooks had hopped through 5 jurisdictions since 2013, each move tied to a major cartel seizure, each one leaving a trail of missing evidence and closed cases in their wake. In Marlin Springs, a 2016 bust netted $2 million in cash and 73 pounds of heroin, the drugs logged, photographed, then marked lost in a fire that never happened, the report signed by Brooks, his name misspelled, Brooks with an extra E, a deliberate error to dodge searches. In Pine Creek, a 2019 fentanyl seizure dropped from 6 bricks to 2 in the official log. No review conducted, no questions asked, the task force roster scrubbed, Daniels' name listed as a temporary advisor, his signature on the final report. Bennett sent Eleanor the timeline, a spreadsheet of dates, names, and discrepancies, the pattern as clear as a confession. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a script, a playbook they'd been running for years, refining with every move, every transfer, every cover-up. That evening, Eleanor faced a digital caseboard in the conference room, the screen glowing with a map of departments, transfers, and scrubbed task forces, the connections forming a web that stretched across state lines, a network that had been hiding in plain sight. Wells joined her tablet in hand, her voice low, her words heavy with discovery. Seizure records were altered post-logging with a DEA override code tied to a staffer who's been dead for 6 years, she said, her fingers swiping through the data, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen. Someone reactivated it through an audit tool, something called Zeno, buried deep in the system. The room froze, the name hanging in the air like a curse, the silence pressing against their ears. Bennett frowned, her brow furrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with confusion. Zeno, that's an old system, pre-cloud, pre-digital overhaul, she said, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the screen, her hands on her hips. Yeah, Wells said, her voice tight, her fingers moving faster now, pulling up the records, the data streaming in front of her. It was built for multi-agency inventory tracking, a relic from the early 2000s, never officially retired, just buried in nested protocols, forgotten by everyone except those who knew where to look. It became a hub for evidence overrides, running on its own unless someone manually stopped it. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with realization. They used my arrest to test it. How long Zeno would delay the alert before it flagged my name, she said, her words slow, deliberate, her mind racing through the implications, the pieces falling into place. It took 180 seconds to ping the system, not 10 like it should have. That's why they had time to run. Bennett stepped up, her voice sharp, her eyes glinting with anger, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Someone inside built. This, someone with access, someone who knew how to exploit the system, she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Her gaze locked on Eleanor, searching for her reaction. Torres walked in, his arms full of files, his face grim, his voice low as he spoke. Lorton Ridge, 2015 cocaine seizure, Operation Stronghold, he said, dropping the files on the table with a heavy thud, the papers spilling out, the text stark under the harsh light. Daniels and Brooks were tactical advisors on the task force, brought in for the raid. The task force dissolved after corruption charges surfaced, but they transferred out before the hammer fell. Miles was the system's liaison, in charge of the evidence logs, the overrides, the tech. They built a network, Eleanor said, her voice low, her tone heavy with realization, her eyes sweeping over the files, the map, the connections forming in her mind. They used Zeno to launder drugs, to move product through the system, to cover their tracks, all while hiding behind federal clearance. Bennett exhaled, her breath sharp, her voice firm, her determination clear. We expose. All of it, she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her eyes locked on Eleanor, a silent promise of action passing between them. The man who came forward arrived at a federal office under an alias, clearing 2 checkpoints with a fake ID, his face hidden under a baseball cap, his movements quick, nervous, as if he expected to be followed. He asked for Eleanor and Bennett by name, refusing to speak to anyone else, insisting on no mics, no recordings, his voice low, urgent, as he sat across from them in a secure room with no windows, the air heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. He looked worn beyond his 59 years, his face lined with guilt, his eyes hollow, carved by choices heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. William Fry, a retired DEA agent from Denver, had left the agency in 1995 under a sealed NDA, his career ending in silence, his name erased from official records. "You're chasing a ghost, a shadow that's been moving for decades," he said, his voice gritty, rough with disuse or regret, his hands trembling as he slid a faded folder across the table, field notes, handwritten reports, the paper yellowed. With age, the ink smudged but legible. Operation Pinnacle, later rebranded as Stronghold, a black-budget task force off the books, funded through slush accounts, he said, his words slow, deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of confession. "We cleaned up messy raids, rerouted drugs to control the flow, wiped footage to protect the agency's image. It started as damage control, a way to keep the public from seeing the cracks. But then the deals came. Heroin disappeared from evidence lockers and someone cashed in. Someone always cashed in." Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't let her expression shift. Her eyes locked on Frey, her voice low, her tone steady as she spoke. "You were in charge of evidence, weren't you?" she said, her words sharp, her gaze pinning him in place, watching. The way his hands tightened around the edge of the table. Frey gave a bitter chuckle, the sound hollow, his eyes flicking to the floor, unable to meet hers for long. "Damage control, that's what they called it," he said, his voice low, his words laced with regret, his shoulders sagging under the weight of memory. "We kept the agency clean, made sure the public saw wins, not messes. But the lines blurred, covering. Errors became theft, then profit, then a system of its own." Bennett leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, her voice cold, her words sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "How'd it turn to dealing? How do you go from covering tracks to selling drugs on the street?" she asked, her tone demanding answers, her hands tightening into fists on the table. Frey's face darkened, his smile fading, his eyes hollow as he spoke, his voice low, heavy with shame. "Offers came. Quiet at first. Subtle. The kind you could ignore if you wanted to," he said, his words slow, deliberate, each one a confession. "A crate vanishes from a seizure, no questions asked, no report filed, no follow-up. Someone wins, someone gets paid, and the line fades until you can't see it anymore, until it's not there at all." Eleanor met his eyes, her gaze steady, unyielding, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet anger that made the room feel smaller. "And Daniels and Brooks? Where do they fit in this machine you built?" she asked, her words sharp, her eyes searching his, looking for the truth behind the guilt. "Late recruits," Frey said, his voice low, his hands tightening around the folder, his knuckles white. "They joined just before Pinnacle folded, right as Stronghold was spinning up. After Stronghold collapsed, they went rogue, took what we taught them, how to scrub evidence, how to exploit audits, how to move product behind badges, and ran with it. Built their own operation. Alone." Bennett pressed, her voice sharp, her eyes narrowing, her tone demanding more, her hands tightening into fists as she leaned closer. "No," Frey said, his voice low, his eyes flicking to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in, his hands trembling as he spoke. "You need clearance. You need access. You need someone to erase mistakes, to make sure the system doesn't catch you. That's where Zeno came in. That's what made it all work." The name hit hard, landing like a stone in the quiet room, the silence pressing against their ears. Bennett sharpened, her posture stiffening, her voice low, her tone laced with suspicion. "Zeno, you're saying that's a person or a system?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, her hands tightening on the table, her gaze locked on Frey. "Both," Frey said, his voice low, his words heavy with the weight of truth, his eyes flicking between them, watching their reactions. Zeno started as a clearance layer, a protocol for multi-agency ops, but it became a ghost ID, a myth we used to clean records. Scripts rewrote logs, changed timestamps, issued orders with federal clearance, made it look like everything was above board. It was a rumor at first, a joke. Zeno took it, we'd say when something went missing, but then it became real, a tool we couldn't control. Cartels saw the value, realized it was safer to let us distribute, to let us take the risk while they took the profit. Eleanor leaned in, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with realization, the pieces falling into place in her mind. So, a classified intel tool, meant to track and share data, became a laundering front, a mask for moving drugs through the system, she said. Her words slow, deliberate, each one heavy with implication. "Exactly," Frey nodded, his voice low, his eyes hollow, his hands tightening around the folder, his knuckles white. It was too perfect, too clean, too easy to exploit. "I'm giving you my files to stop them, to end this once and for all. This isn't a network, it's a machine, built on silence, on complicity, on people looking the other way." The last agent who flagged Zeno, who tried to expose it, was locked away in a psych ward, her record sealed, her career destroyed. I retired to escape, to get out before it swallowed me too. He left quietly, the door clicking shut behind him, with a soft finality, the sound echoing in the small room. Silence hung heavy, the air thick with the weight of his words, the folder on the table a tangible reminder of the rot he'd helped build. Bennett turned to Eleanor, her brow furrowed, her voice low, her tone laced with cautious skepticism. "You buy his story?" she asked, her eyes searching Eleanor's, looking for a sign of doubt or certainty, her hands resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "It fits," Eleanor said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering, her mind already racing through the implications, the connections forming like a map in her head. "That's enough for now. We verify every detail, cross-check his files, dig until we hit bedrock." She picked up the folder, the paper rough under her fingers, the weight of it heavier than its pages suggested, and tucked it under her arm, her movements deliberate. Her focus, absolute. Torres appeared at the door, his face grim, his voice low as he stepped into the room. A burner phone's call log printout in his hand, the paper creased from being folded too many times. "We traced a burner tied to Brooks," he said, his tone heavy, his eyes flicking between Eleanor and Bennett, the tension in his posture clear. "It pinged a tower in Louisiana last week, then Mexico 3 days ago, then back to a cell site near the Texas border yesterday. They're setting up a new route, moving fast, likely prepping for a drop." Eleanor stood firm, her jaw tightening, her voice low, her tone laced with determination, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. "We catch them before they make that drop," she said, her words sharp, her posture unyielding, her mind already mapping out the next steps. "No shadows, no games. We use their playbook against them, hit them where they think they're safe." She turned to Bennett, her orders clear, her voice steady. "Get me a full workup on those locations. Known routes, cartel activity, anything that ties to Miles or their past ops. We move fast." Bennett nodded, her movements quick, her focus razor sharp, her voice firm as she replied, "I'll have it in 2 hours." Torres added, his voice low, his tone urgent. "I've got a lead on an old analyst who flagged Zeno years back, got pushed out for it. She'll talk, but only off record, and only to you, Director. She doesn't trust anyone else." Eleanor agreed without hesitation, her voice steady, her decision made in an instant, her eyes locked on Torres. "Set it up. 1 hour, quiet spot. No cameras, no tails. She didn't wait for a response, her mind already shifting to the meeting, the information she needed, the pieces of the puzzle still missing. Torres picked a small cafe for the meet. A hole-in-the-wall spot with no sign out front, just a faded green awning sagging over the door and a buzzer you had to know to press. Inside, it smelled of fresh coffee and faint spice, the air warm, a lone ceiling fan spinning slow overhead, its blades creaking with every turn, stirring the air just enough to keep it from feeling stale. The walls were lined with mismatched frames, old photos of the town, a faded map of Colorado, a Polaroid of the owner with a prize trout, giving the place a lived-in feel, a quiet authenticity that made it the kind of spot where secrets could be shared without drawing attention. Elena took a back booth, the cracked red vinyl creaking under her weight, her position giving her a clear view of the entrance, her body relaxed, but her senses sharp, her eyes tracking every movement without seeming to. Her jacket lay folded, beside her on the seat within reach, its weight a subtle reminder of the tools she carried. Not a gun, not today, but a recorder, a notebook, a pen, the things she'd need to capture every word. She didn't need a weapon. Her authority was enough, her presence a shield in itself. The woman who entered wore a gray coat, the collar turned up against the chill, a black backpack slung over one shoulder, her steps quick, purposeful, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Eleanor. She walked straight to the booth, sat, without fuss, her movements efficient, and slid a USB drive across the table, pinning it with a finger, her voice low, steady, her gaze unflinching. "Karen Lee," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes sharp, taking in Eleanor's calm, her control, as if assessing whether she could be trusted. Ex-DEA cyber analyst, fired 3 years ago for digging where I wasn't supposed to. Official, reason. Mishandled data, a clerical error they blew up to get rid of me. Real reason. I flagged something that spooked the higher-ups, something they didn't want anyone touching. Eleanor nodded, her posture unchanged, her voice low, her tone, encouraging Lee to continue, her eyes locked on the woman's, giving her full attention. "Zeno," she said, the name dropping like a stone, her words heavy, her gaze steady, watching for Lee's reaction, the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers pressed harder against the USB drive. Lee gave a weary smirk, the expression tinged with bitterness, her eyes darkening as she spoke, her voice low, tight with the weight of memory. "You know the name, but you don't know the beast," she said, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet anger, her hands steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "It's called a ghost ID, a script, a myth to clean records, to make problems disappear. But it's more than that. It's a lattice, a network of code built post 9/11 for cross-agency data syncing, meant to streamline ops after the towers fell. It grabbed, copied, stored data from DEA, Customs, FBI, even intel agencies with full clearance, meant to watch, to track, to share, not to act, not to rewrite." Eleanor listened, still, her hands resting on the table, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp, her eyes locked on Lee, taking in every word, every detail. Lee's voice tightened, her words coming faster now, her hands gesturing slightly as she spoke, her frustration bleeding through. "Someone added execution commands, turned it into a weapon," she said, her tone sharp, her eyes glinting with anger, her fingers tapping the USB drive for emphasis. Access tunnels rewrote logs, reassigned identities, moved product through the system like it was nothing. A kilo seized in Texas could vanish from the record, reassigned to a bust in Phoenix, the paperwork fixed, the chain of custody rewritten. In our world, paperwork is truth. If the paper says it's gone, no questions asked. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice low, her tone steady, her words cutting through the tension in the air. Why wasn't it caught sooner? How does something like that hide in plain sight for so long? She asked, her eyes narrowing, her mind racing through the implications, the scale of the breach Lee was describing. "I caught it," Lee said, her voice flat, her eyes hard, her hands tightening into fists on the table, her knuckles white. That's why I'm gone. Why I'm sitting here instead of behind a desk at headquarters. She pulled a slim folder from her backpack, opened it with a flick of her wrist, showing 3 pages, one with Eleanor's signature at the bottom. The ink faded but unmistakable. You don't recall every onboarding form you sign as director? No one does, Lee said, her tone matter-of-fact, her eyes flicking to Eleanor's, watching her reaction. Most directors don't even read the fine print. They trust the system to be clean. Buried in the approvals you signed your first week was a system renewal, a line item for maintenance of legacy protocols. Zeno was in it, hidden in plain sight, approved under your name. Eleanor stared at her initials, the date clear. Her first week on the job. The paper a relic of a time when she'd trusted the system to be as clean as she was. Lee didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just looked tired, her eyes hollow, her voice low as she continued. They've been using your clearance for a year, maybe longer, she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with a quiet sympathy, her hands resting on the folder, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Every fake arrest, every rerouted shipment of drugs, every missing witness statement. It's been logged under your name, your authority, your signature. Eleanor felt no guilt, only a cold, focused anger, her hands steady as she closed the folder, her voice low, her tone unshaken, her eyes locked on Lee's. They baited me with that stop to test Zeno's alert delay, she said, her words slow, deliberate, her mind piecing together the timeline, the strategy behind their move. When it lagged, when it took 180 seconds instead of 10 to flag my name, they knew it worked, knew they could keep using it. When it finally pinged, when the system caught up, they ran, because they knew someone might start looking. Lee nodded, her jaw tightening, her voice low, her tone laced with a grim certainty, her eyes glinting with determination. They knew someone was watching again, someone who wouldn't let it slide, she said, her words heavy, her hands pushing the USB drive closer to Eleanor, a silent offering of evidence, of truth. Eleanor closed the folder, her fingers steady, her voice low, her tone resolute, her eyes locked on Lee's, a silent promise passing between them. I'm not here for a title, not here to save my name, she said, her words sharp, her posture unyielding, her focus absolute. I'm here to end this, to burn it down and make sure it can't grow back. Lee studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Eleanor's, looking for a crack, a sign of weakness, finding none. Then burn the root, not the branches, she said, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet urgency, her hands tightening into fists on the table. It's baked into the system, shielded by layers of red tape, protected by people who profit from it staying hidden. Eleanor stood, tucking the folder and USB into her bag, her movements calm, deliberate, her voice steady as she spoke. We'll make it exposed, drag it into the light, where it can't survive, she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with determination, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. We catch them before they make that drop, she said, her words sharp, her posture unyielding, her mind already mapping out the next steps. No shadows, no games. We use their playbook against them, hit them where they think they're safe. She turned to Bennett, her orders clear, her voice steady. Get me a full workup on those locations. Known routes, cartel activity, anything that ties to Miles or their past ops. We move fast. Bennett nodded, her movements quick, her focus razor sharp, her voice firm as she replied, I'll have it in 2 hours. Torres added, his voice low, his tone urgent. I've got a lead on an old analyst who flagged Zeno years back, got pushed out for it. She'll talk, but only off record, and only to you, Director. She doesn't trust anyone else, Eleanor. Agreed without hesitation, her voice steady, her decision made in an instant, her eyes locked on Torres. Set it up. 1 hour, quiet spot, no cameras, no tails. She didn't wait for a response, her mind already shifting to the meeting, the information she needed, the pieces of the puzzle still missing. Torres picked a small cafe for the meet. A hole-in-the-wall spot with no sign out front, just a faded green awning sagging over the door and a buzzer you had to know to press. Inside, it smelled of fresh coffee and faint spice. The air warm, a lone ceiling fan spinning slow overhead, its blades creaking with every turn, stirring the air just enough to keep it from feeling stale. The walls were lined with mismatched frames, old photos of the town, a faded map of Colorado, a Polaroid of the owner with a prize trout, giving the place a lived-in feel, a quiet authenticity that made it the kind of spot where secrets could be shared without drawing attention. Eleanor took a back booth, the cracked red vinyl creaking under her weight, her position giving her a clear view of the entrance. Her body relaxed, but her senses sharp, her eyes tracking every movement without seeming to. Her jacket lay folded. Beside her on the seat, within reach, its weight a subtle reminder of the tools she carried. Not a gun, not today, but a recorder, a notebook, a pen, the things she'd need to capture every word. She didn't need a weapon. Her authority was enough, her presence a shield in itself. The woman who entered wore a gray coat, the collar turned up against the chill, a black backpack slung over one shoulder, her steps quick, purposeful, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Eleanor. She walked straight to the booth, sat, without fuss, her movements efficient, and slid a USB drive across the table, pinning it with a finger, her voice low, steady, her gaze unflinching. "Karen Lee," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes sharp, taking in Eleanor's calm, her control, as if assessing whether she could be trusted. Ex-DEA cyber analyst, fired 3 years ago for digging where I wasn't supposed to. Official. Reason. Mishandled data. A clerical error they blew up to get rid of me. Real reason. I flagged something that spooked the higher-ups, something they didn't want anyone touching. Eleanor nodded, her posture unchanged, her voice low, her tone encouraging Lee to continue, her eyes locked on the woman's, giving her full attention. "Zeno," she said, the name dropping like a stone, her words heavy, her gaze steady, watching for Lee's reaction, the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers pressed harder against the USB drive. Lee gave a weary smirk, the expression tinged with bitterness, her eyes darkening as she spoke, her voice low, tight, with the weight of memory. "You know the name, but you don't know the beast," she said, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet anger, her hands steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "It's called a ghost ID, a script, a myth to clean records, to make problems disappear. But it's more than that. It's a lattice, a network of code built post 9/11 for cross-agency data syncing, meant to streamline ops after the towers fell. It grabbed, copied, stored data from DEA, Customs, FBI, even intel agencies with full clearance, meant to watch, to track, to share, not to act, not to rewrite." Eleanor listened, still, her hands resting on the table, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp, her eyes locked on Lee, taking in every word, every detail. Lee's voice tightened, her words coming faster now, her hands gesturing slightly as she spoke, her frustration bleeding through. "Someone added execution commands, turned it into a weapon," she said, her tone sharp, her eyes glinting with anger, her fingers tapping the USB drive for emphasis. "Access tunnels rewrote logs, reassigned identities, moved product through the system like it was nothing. A kilo seized in Texas could vanish from the record, reassigned to a bust in Phoenix, the paperwork fixed, the chain of custody rewritten. In our world, paperwork is truth. If the paper says it's gone, no questions asked." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice low, her tone steady, her words cutting through the tension in the air. "Why wasn't it caught sooner? How does something like that hide in plain sight for so long?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, her mind racing through the implications, the scale of the breach Lee was describing. I caught it, Lee said, her voice flat, her eyes hard, her hands tightening into fists on the table, her knuckles white. That's why I'm gone. Why I'm sitting here instead of behind a desk at headquarters. She pulled a slim folder from her backpack, opened it with a flick of her wrist, showing 3 pages, one with Eleanor's signature at the bottom. The ink faded but unmistakable. You don't recall every onboarding form you sign as director? No one does, Lee said, her tone matter-of-fact, her eyes flicking to Eleanor's, watching her reaction. Most directors don't even read the fine print. They trust the system to be clean. Buried in the approvals you signed your first week was a system renewal, a line item for maintenance of legacy protocols. Zeno was in it, hidden in plain sight, approved under your name. Eleanor stared at her initials, the date clear, her first week on the job. The paper a relic of a time when she trusted the system to be as clean as she was. Lee didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just looked tired, her eyes hollow, her voice low as she continued. They've been using your clearance for a year, maybe longer, she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with a quiet sympathy, her hands resting on the folder, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Every fake arrest, every rerouted shipment of drugs, every missing witness statement, it's been logged under your name, your authority, your signature. Eleanor felt no guilt, only a cold, focused anger, her hands steady as she closed the folder. Her voice low, her tone unshaken, her eyes locked on Lee's. They baited me with that stop to test Zeno's alert delay, she said. Her words, slow, deliberate, her mind piecing together the timeline, the strategy behind their move. When it lagged, when it took 180 seconds instead of 10 to flag my name, they knew it worked, knew they could keep using it. When it finally pinged, when the system caught up, they ran, because they knew someone might start looking. Lee nodded, her jaw tightening, her voice low, her tone laced with a grim certainty, her eyes glinting with determination. They knew someone was watching again, someone who wouldn't let it slide, she said, her words heavy, her hands pushing the USB drive closer to Eleanor, a silent offering of evidence, of truth. Eleanor closed the folder, her fingers steady, her voice low, her tone resolute, her eyes locked on Lee's, a silent promise passing between them. I'm not here for a title, not here to save my name, she said, her words sharp, her posture unyielding, her focus absolute. I'm here to end this, to burn it down and make sure it can't grow back. Lee studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Eleanor's, looking for a crack, a sign of weakness, finding none. Then burn the root, not the branches, she said, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet urgency, her hands tightening into fists on the table. It's baked into the system, shielded by layers of red tape, protected by people who profit from it staying hidden. Eleanor stood, tucking the folder and USB into her bag, her movements calm, deliberate, her voice steady as she spoke. We'll make it exposed. Drag it into the light where it can't survive, she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with determination, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. She left the cafe without looking back, her steps calm, the evidence heavy in her bag, her purpose heavier in her chest. Zeno wasn't a glitch, wasn't a simple exploit. It was a parasite, hidden by bureaucracy, thriving in the dark corners of a system that had been built to protect, not to prey. And it was waking up, stirring under the pressure of their investigation, ready to fight back. That night, after briefing Torres and Bennett in a secure room at the Federal Building, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of overworked laptops, Eleanor returned to her sedan in the underground garage, the concrete walls echoing with the sound of her steps. Her badge cleared the gate with a soft beep, the metal arm rising with a groan, the lot empty save for a few scattered vehicles, their shapes indistinct in the dim light, her steps echoing under the harsh fluorescent bulbs that buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the oil-stained floor. She approached her car, keys out, her senses sharp, her eyes scanning the shadows, a habit born from years of working cases where threats could come from anywhere. It was subtle, but she caught it, the wipers on her windshield slightly raised. Not flush against the glass as she'd left them, the hood off by a hair, a misalignment so small most wouldn't notice. But she wasn't most people. She stopped, her body tensing, her breath steady as she circled the vehicle, her eyes scanning every inch, checking the undercarriage's shadow with a quick glance, her movements deliberate, her mind racing through the possibilities. A wire, snaked from the wheel well, tucked tight against the metal, its presence a silent threat, its purpose unclear but undeniable. She stepped back fast, her heart pounding but her hands steady, her voice low as she called for security over her comms. Her words clipped, urgent. "I need a sweep now. My vehicle, garage level 3, possible tampering." Security swept the car in 10 minutes, their movements quick, efficient, their flashlights cutting through the dim light, their voices low as they worked. No bomb, just a GPS relay wired to the ignition, built to track her movements, manipulate her route or stall her engine on command, a piece of tech meant for surveillance sabotage, waiting for a remote trigger to activate. The tech team called it a silent hunter, the kind of device used by those who wanted to watch their prey without being seen, the kind that could turn a routine drive into a trap. But the note tucked behind the visor hit harder. The paper, folded neatly, the block letters scrawled in black ink, sharp and deliberate. "Go home, Director, or someone else pays." Eleanor's jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around the note, her eyes narrowing as she read it again. The threat clear, the target unmistakable. She knew someone else meant her nephew, the boy she'd played board games with just days ago, his laughter still echoing in her mind, his smile a memory she couldn't let be tainted by this. Within an hour, his house in Colorado Springs was under federal guard, tactical teams in unmarked vans, plainclothes agents on every corner, comms locked and encrypted. Her brother's family moved to a safe house under her direct orders, their safety non-negotiable. Eleanor didn't call, didn't show fear, didn't let the threat derail her focus. She trusted her team to handle it, to keep them safe, and got back to work, her resolve hardening, her anger a fuel that burned cold and steady, her determination unyielding. By morning, the task force pivoted to pursuit, their movements swift, their focus absolute, their goal clear. Find Daniels, Brooks, and Miles before they could disappear into the shadows again. Using Lee's files and Bennett's audits, Eleanor launched a multi-state sting. Phoenix, Baton Rouge, St. Louis, Bakersfield, old hubs for fake inventory tied to ghost task forces, locations where Zeno's fingerprints had been found in altered logs, in missing evidence, in buried cases. Federal units moved silently, their vehicles unmarked, their comms encrypted, air support circling overhead. No press, no leaks, just precision and purpose. In Phoenix, a DEA storage site, reported burned to the ground in 2018, was found operational under a Delaware shell company, its doors guarded by armed men who scattered when agents breached the perimeter, their boots pounding dirt as they fled into the desert. Agents found 6 crates of narcotics, DEA sealed, marked destroyed years ago, the seals intact, the drugs untouched, the kind of evidence that could only have come from a federal vault, the kind that shouldn't exist. The crew fled, leaving tracks in the sand, an open drawer spilling fake IDs, burner phones, and a ledger of drop points stretching from Arizona to the Gulf Coast. In Baton Rouge, a trailer yard was gutted, its office torched hours before agents arrived, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and ash, but a scorched safe held redacted files, including Carter's arrest, duplicated with conflicting timestamps. The discrepancies a map of lies that pointed back to Daniels and Brooks. In St. Louis, a safe house tied to an inactive agent was empty when agents kicked down the door, beds still warm, coffee cups steaming on the counter, a server left behind with partial Zeno logs, one file labeled with Miles's name, the data, fragmented but damning, a breadcrumb trail that led nowhere and everywhere. In Bakersfield, A man matching Brooks's description boarded a crop duster at an abandoned airstrip, the plane's engine roaring to life as agents closed in, their shouts lost in the wind. By the time they reached the tarmac, the plane was gone, vanishing into the horizon. No flight plan, no record, no trace. Each raid raised more shadows than answers, the web growing larger with every bust, the threads stretching further than they'd imagined. Witnesses vanished before agents could reach them, their homes empty, their phones disconnected, their lives erased overnight. Phones went dead, their signals dropping off the grid as if they'd never existed. Cameras failed, their feeds looping. Static or cutting to black just as suspects appeared on screen. Torres stood with Eleanor after the fourth bust fizzled, staring at photos, maps, weak links pinned to a board in the command center, the air thick with frustration, their hands on their hips, their eyes scanning the evidence for something they'd missed. "We're chasing ghosts, Director," he said, his voice low, his tone heavy with exhaustion, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of their failures. "No," Eleanor said, her voice low, her tone steady, her eyes glinting. With determination, her posture unyielding despite the setbacks. "We're chasing the breeze that moves them, the currents they ride to stay hidden. That's where the fire hides, where the real fight is." She didn't mention the note, the wire, or her nephew's guards. Didn't let her personal stakes bleed into the mission. Her focus absolute, her resolve unbreakable. She turned to the board, her fingers tracing a line between Phoenix and Houston, her voice low, her tone laced with realization. "Zeno thrives by dodging blame, by staying invisible. We change that. We make noise, force a reaction, make them move where we can see them." Bennett entered, her face grim, her steps heavy as she handed Eleanor a red folder stamped with a classified alert. The paper crisp, the seal unbroken, the weight of it heavy in her hands. "Agent Lucas Chen, one of our comms analysts, went dark in Lorton Ridge last night," she said, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet anger, her eyes darkening as she spoke. "His car was found burned on a logging road, no signs of a fight, no distress call, nothing to suggest he saw it coming. In the glove box, his ID was sliced in half, and there was a note. One more echo, and the system dies with him." Eleanor stared at the note, her jaw tightening, her fingers folding the paper into her pocket, her anger flaring hot and sharp, a fire that burned behind her eyes. She looked at Torres and Bennett, her voice low, her tone steady despite the rage simmering beneath, her resolve hardening with every word. "They're not saving Zeno. They're arming it, turning it into a weapon against us," she said. Her words heavy, her eyes glinting with determination, her posture unyielding. "If they'll hit our people, if they'll kill to protect this, they're building something bigger, something we can't let stand." Bennett's voice was steel, her jaw tightening, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "We hit now before they can move again, before another agent vanishes, before another body turns up," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her posture rigid, her focus absolute. "We gut their system, rip it apart, leave them nowhere to hide." Eleanor nodded, her voice low, her tone laced with a cold determination, her eyes locked on Bennett's, a silent agreement passing between them. "No waiting for names, no playing their game," she said, her words sharp, her mind already mapping out the next steps, the next strike. "We intercept the next shipment, drain their route, cut them off at the source. In the kill zone, 8 Gray. Desert choke point under a narrow pass. The kind of place where the wind howled through the rocks like a warning. The convoy rolled blind, their tires kicking up dust that hung in the air like a shroud, their engines growling in the stillness of the night. A coyote's cry cut the silence, sharp and eerie, the sound echoing off the canyon walls as the vehicles moved in a tight line, their headlights off, their drivers relying on night vision to navigate the treacherous terrain. In the rear SUV, a gunman peered through tinted glass, his hands tight on his SMG, his eyes scanning the shadows, his body tense with the kind of unease that came from too many close calls. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice low, his words heavy with suspicion, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon, his knuckles white. "Chill," the driver said, his tone dismissive, his eyes flicking to the rear view. Mirror, his hands steady on the wheel despite the tension in the air. "You get twitchy every West Texas run, man. It's just the dark playing tricks on you." "No," the gunman said, his voice sharper now, his eyes narrowing as he scanned. The ridge above, the shadows moving in ways that didn't feel natural. "This is too quiet, too still. Something's off." 30 seconds later, chaos hit like a storm breaking over the desert, the silence shattered by the sound of metal spikes tearing through rubber, the second-to-last sedan's tires blowing. Out with a series of loud pops, the vehicle skidding in a dust cloud as the engine sputtered and died. The trailing SUV braked hard, its tires screeching against the dirt, but flashbangs dropped from the ridge above, their explosions blinding, the light searing through the darkness, the sound deafening as it echoed off the canyon walls. "Go!" Eleanor's voice snapped through comms, clear, commanding, her tone cutting through the chaos, her orders absolute. "Teams, hit and flank now, don't let them scatter!" Agents in black tactical gear rappelled down the ridge, their boots pounding dirt as they descended, their movements swift, precise, their rifles up, their night vision goggles glowing faintly in the dark. Gunfire flashed as convoy guards leapt. From the lead truck, their weapons drawn, their shots wild, their bullets kicking up sand as they fired blindly into the shadows. Agents moved tight, using the rocks and shadows for cover, their return fire controlled, precise, their training evident in every step, every shot. Eleanor didn't hang back, didn't lead from the sidelines. She advanced with the breach team, her rifle ready, her breath steady, her movements fluid, despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins, her focus absolute. A gunman rounded the cargo truck, his weapon up, his eyes wild with panic as he spotted her. She dropped him with a burst to the chest, 3 shots in tight succession, the impact knocking him back into the dirt, his gun clattering against the ground as he fell. She closed in, her boots kicking up dust, slamming her elbow into his throat to ensure he stayed down, wrenching his gun away with a sharp twist and kneeing his sternum for good measure, her movements precise, her control unyielding. He collapsed. With a choked gasp, his body limp, his threat neutralized. "2 moving right," Bennett called over comms, her voice sharp, her words cutting through the gunfire, her position on the ridge giving her a clear view of the battlefield. "Got it," Torres replied, his voice steady, his boots pounding dirt as he moved to intercept. His rifle up, his eyes scanning the shadows. The rear SUV's door flew open with a loud bang, 2 men tumbling out, one with a sawed-off shotgun, the other clutching a baton, their movements frantic, their faces twisted with a mix of fear and defiance. The baton guy charged Eleanor, his weapon raised, his shout raw as he swung for her head. She dodged with a quick sidestep, the baton whistling past her ear, grabbing his arm mid-swing, twisting it hard until she felt the joint strain, and slammed him into the truck's edge, the metal denting under the impact, his body crumpling to the ground with a groan. The shotgun man aimed, his finger on the trigger, his eyes wild as he lined up his shot. Eleanor ducked, dropped low to the ground, the blast roaring over her head, the heat of it singeing her jacket, and tackled his legs with a force that knocked the wind out of him, both of them hitting the dirt hard. He fell, firing wide, the shot kicking up sand a foot from her head, and she smashed her rifle butt into his skull, the crack of bone loud in the chaos, knocking him out cold, his body going limp beneath her. Torres took the 3rd truck, his voice sharp over comms, his movements swift as he cleared the area, his rifle sweeping the shadows. "Left flank clear," he said, his tone steady, his eyes scanning for movement. "Watch for runners. They'll try to bolt." A driver bolted from the cab of the lead truck, his pistol shaking in his hand, his steps uneven as he sprinted. Across the sand, his breath coming in panicked gasps, his eyes wide with fear. Eleanor sprinted after him, her boots pounding the ground, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her focus absolute as she closed the distance, not shooting yet, not wanting to risk a stray bullet in the dark. She caught him near a drop-off, the edge of a dry wash looming in the shadows, tackling him hard, both of them rolling down the incline in a tangle of limbs, dust choking her lungs, the impact jarring her ribs, her shoulder slamming into a rock. His fist grazed her cheek, the blow glancing but enough to make her taste blood, the copper tang sharp on her tongue. He swung wildly, his panic fueling his strength, his fist catching her jaw with a glancing blow that made her head snap to the side. She blocked his next swing with her forearm, her training kicking in, her movements precise despite the pain, and slammed her palm into his nose, breaking it with a wet crunch, the sound loud in the quiet of the wash. He screamed, clutching, his face blood pouring through his fingers, his eyes wide with shock. She kneed his gut, the impact doubling him over, and pinned him with her forearm across his throat, her voice low, a snarl of fury as she spoke. "You're done," she said, her words sharp, her eyes glinting with anger, her hands steady as she zip-tied his wrists, her breaths coming in sharp gasps, her body aching but her focus unbroken. Bennett's voice crackled through comms, sharp and urgent, cutting through the fading gunfire, the sound of her boots crunching gravel as she moved into position. "Director, confirmed. Daniels and Brooks are on the East Ridge behind the wrecked SUV," she said, her tone steady, her words clear despite the chaos. "They're heading for the gulch, trying to slip out the back." Eleanor's eyes tightened, her jaw clenching, her voice low, her tone laced with determination as she hauled herself up, her hands brushing dirt from her jacket, her rifle back in her grip. "They're slipping," she said, her words sharp, her focus absolute as she started moving, her boots pounding the ground, Torres on her left, weaving through rocks as shots rang out, cover fire from a stray gunman still fighting, his bullets kicking up sand near their feet. "They're pulling us off, trying to distract us," Torres yelled, his voice rough, his rifle up, his eyes scanning the shadows for the shooter, his movements swift despite the danger. "Let them try," Eleanor said, not slowing, her voice steady, her eyes locked on the gulch ahead, her determination unyielding. The gulch dropped behind the SUV, a dry scar in the earth, its walls steep, its shadows deep, the kind of place you could disappear into if you knew the terrain. Daniels and Brooks moved fast, their guns drawn, their steps uneven on the rocky ground, their breaths coming in sharp gasps as they hit the ridge. They turned, startled as Eleanor closed in, her rifle up, her posture unyielding, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. "You should have stayed in D.C., lady," Daniels growled, his voice raw, his pistol raising, his finger tightening on the trigger, his shoulder already bleeding from a graze he'd taken earlier, the blood staining his uniform dark. Eleanor fired, clipping his shoulder with a single shot, the impact knocking the gun from his hand, the weapon skittering across the dirt as he stumbled back, his face twisting with pain. Brooks roared, charging her like a bull, his eyes wild, his fists clenched, his body fueled by adrenaline and rage. She met him head-on, tackling him into the gulch wall with a crunch that echoed off the rocks, the impact jarring her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. His fist hit her ribs, the blow hard enough to make her grunt, the pain sharp and searing, her vision blurring for a split second. She twisted, drove her elbow into his throat with a force that made him choke, his hands flying to his neck, his swing wild as he landed an uppercut to her jaw, the impact staggering her, her head snapping back, the taste of blood sharp on her tongue. Torres hit Daniels, tackling him low, slamming him into the sand with a force that knocked the wind out of both of them, their bodies rolling in a tangle of limbs, trading blows as they fought for control. Daniels fought dirty, his elbow slamming into Torres' ribs, his knee driving into his thigh. But Torres was sharper, angrier, his training giving him the edge. He kneed Daniels' thigh, elbowed his temple with a crack that made Daniels' eyes roll back, pinned him with a forearm across his throat, his voice a low growl as he spoke, his anger raw, his grip unyielding. "Plant something now, punk," he said, his words sharp, his eyes glinting with fury, his hands steady as he cuffed Daniels, yanking him to his feet with a rough jerk. Daniel spat blood, his face twisted with pain, his voice low, his tone laced with defiance despite his position, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "You're too late," he said, his words heavy, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his shoulder bleeding steadily, the red soaking through his shirt, pooling in the dirt beneath him. Eleanor, grappling with Brooks, ducked a wild hook, the swing, whistling past her ear, and stomped his shin with a force that made him stumble, his balance faltering, his face twisting with pain. She surged forward, head-butting his nose with a snap, the sound wet and sharp, blood pouring down his face, his eyes watering as he roared in pain. She flipped him with a quick twist, using his momentum against him, slamming his face into the dirt with a force that made him groan, her knee pinning his back, her hands twisting his arm behind him until he stopped struggling. Her voice low, her tone laced with a cold fury. "I should have ended you on that highway," Brooks gasped, his voice muffled by the dirt, his body shaking with pain, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You'll rot instead," Eleanor said, her voice steady, her hands securing his wrists. With zip ties, her eyes glinting with determination, her focus unbroken despite the ache in her ribs, the bruise forming on her jaw, the blood drying on her lip. She stood, her rifle steady, her breaths hard but controlled, her posture unyielding as she waved agents over, her voice sharp, her orders clear. "Take them both," she said, her tone leaving no room for delay, her eyes locked on Daniel's and Brooks, watching as they were hauled to their feet, their heads hanging, their defiance broken. "Secure transport, no contact, no stops. Black site holding, 1 hour, no exceptions." As agents hauled them away, their boots dragging in the dirt, their cuffs clinking with every step, Torres turned to Eleanor, his face streaked with dust, his eyes glinting with a mix of relief and exhaustion, his voice low, his tone heavy with the weight of the fight. "That was tight," he said, his words slow, his hands on his hips, his breaths still coming in sharp gasps, his body aching from the struggle. "Too tight," Eleanor muttered, her knuckles sore, her ribs throbbing, her jaw tender. Her eyes, sharp as she scanned the scene, taking in the wreckage, the bodies, the evidence scattered across the desert floor. They didn't expect us to hit them direct, to come at them like this. They always ran before, always slipped away. This time they fought, stood their ground. Torres frowned, his brow furrowing, his voice low, his tone laced with concern, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, searching for her thoughts. "That means they knew something we didn't," he said, his words heavy, his hands tightening into fists at his sides, his mind racing through the possibilities, the implications of their resistance. Eleanor nodded, her jaw tightening, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet realization, her eyes glinting with determination. "We stopped the play, disrupted their move, but we haven't stopped the game. Not yet," she said, her words slow, her mind already shifting to the next step, the next fight. Her comms buzzed, Bennett's voice crackling through, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet of the desert night. "Director, we cracked the lead truck's manifest," she said, her tone steady, her words clear, the sound of papers rustling in the background as she spoke. "There's a second meet point, domestic, Houston, 48 hours from now. Signed by Miles himself, his signature on the drop order, clear as day." Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with realization, her hands tightening around her rifle, the weight of it grounding her. "He's here, in the States," she said, her words heavy, her mind racing through the implications, the possibilities, the trap that might be waiting. Bennett paused, her voice low, her tone laced with caution, her words careful as she spoke. "Or he wants us to think he left Mexico, that he's setting up here," she said, her tone heavy, her mind already mapping out the risks, the strategies. "He's baiting us, drawing us in, trying to control the board." Eleanor looked across. The desert, the flashing lights of their vehicles cutting through the darkness. Their victory marked by the wreckage scattered across the sand, the bodies zip-tied and loaded into vans, the evidence bagged and tagged under the harsh glare of floodlights. She didn't smile, didn't let herself feel the win, her focus absolute, her resolve unyielding. This wasn't the end, it was the hook, the next move in a game that was far from over, a game she intended to win. The digital forensics lab in the federal annex glowed red under emergency lighting, the air cold, the servers humming with a low, steady drone that filled the room, their lights blinking in sync like a heartbeat. The raid's USB took hours to break. Its encryption wasn't cartel or rogue, but custom, built by someone who knew DEA systems inside out, someone who'd designed it to keep secrets even under pressure. Lee stood at the console, her eyes locked on the feed, her face pale with recognition, her hands steady as she worked, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet dread as she spoke. "This isn't just data, it's a map," she said, her words heavy, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen, the files opening one by one, each one a piece of the puzzle they'd been chasing. Bennett cross-checked the files. As they opened, her fingers flying over her laptop, Torres and Eleanor watching over her shoulder, their postures tense, their focus absolute. The files weren't just logs, they were profiles, a decade's worth of data tagged by badge number and department, a catalog of corruption that stretched across state lines, across agencies, across years. Arrests, transfers, audits, memos, custody chains across 6 precincts, near identical in their discrepancies, their lies, their erasures. Eleanor stepped up, her arms folded, her voice low, her tone steady despite the weight of what they were. Seeing, her eyes scanning the screen, taking in every detail. "How many names are we looking at?" she asked, her words sharp, her posture rigid, her mind already mapping out the scale of the network, the scope of the fight ahead. 70, Lee said, her voice low, her tone heavy with the weight of the number, her hands tightening around the edge of the console, her knuckles white. 70 officers, most still active, still on the job, still wearing badges. Bennett exhaled, her breath sharp, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet anger, her eyes darkening as she read. The names, the roles, the connections, not just dirty cops, enablers, facilitators, the kind who look the other way for a cut, she said, her words heavy, her hands tightening into fists on the table, her focus absolute. They moved evidence, covered tracks, reclassified cartel, drugs as destroyed, then funneled them back into circulation. Some ran routes themselves while filing clean reports, their records spotless, their hands dirty. "All tied to federal task forces," Torres said, his voice low, his tone laced with realization, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the files, the connections forming in his mind, the web growing clearer with every name, every link. Lee dug deeper, her fingers flying over the keyboard, her voice tight, her tone laced with a quiet dread as she opened another file, the data streaming in front of her, the screen glowing with classified headers, redacted lines, hidden truths. "It's worse." "Aye than that," she said, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, then back to the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she worked, the weight of the discovery pressing against her. Project Stronghold, locked behind 3 clearances, reactivated by a ghost ID, the same one tied to Xeno. She pulled up the archives, program outlines, budgets, DEA memos, the paper trail of a project that should have died years ago, the kind of operation that left bodies in its wake. Stronghold aimed to leak drugs into cartels, trace their routes, build intel on their networks, a high-risk op meant to turn the enemy's supply against them. It shut down after a Florida leak. In 2011 killed 3 civilians, the fallout public, the project buried, or so they'd thought. "Funding restarted 5 years ago," Lee said, her voice low, her tone heavy with the weight of the truth, her fingers swiping through the budget lines, the approvals, the signatures. "It came through an anti-crime budget, signed by your predecessor, director. Eleanor's mouth tightened, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone laced with a cold anger, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, her posture rigid, her focus absolute. "He was dirty?" she asked, her words sharp, her eyes locked on Lee, searching for the truth, the betrayal behind the signature. "No," Lee said, flipping through the pages, her voice steady, her tone factual, her eyes flicking to Eleanor. Then back to the screen, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. He thought it was the original program, safe leaks, controlled ops, intel gathering. He didn't know it had been hijacked, turned into something else, something uglier. Torres swore under his breath, his voice low, his tone laced with anger, his hands tightening into fists at his sides, his eyes darkening as he processed the betrayal, the scale of the deception. "They used our own money, our own resources, to rebuild it," he said, his words heavy, his posture rigid, his focus absolute. "But they didn't trace roots, didn't build intel. They laundered drugs, moved product, used the program as a front. The intel was a lie, a smokescreen to keep us blind." "They became the cartel's arm," Lee said, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet dread, her eyes glinting with realization, her hands tightening around the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "They used DEA protections meant for counterterrorism, exploited classified corners where no one thought to look, where no one dared to question." Eleanor stared at the screen, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing, her voice low, her tone heavy with realization, her posture unyielding despite the weight of the truth. Victor Miles's name appeared in the files, listed as systems architect, then auditor under a new alias, Michael Velt. In every Xeno-linked operation, his fingerprints on every altered log, every rerouted shipment, every buried case. He didn't join the network. He built it, she said, her words slow, deliberate, her mind racing through the implications, the scale of his betrayal, the depth of his reach. Bennett's voice was tight, her jaw clenching, her eyes glinting, with a fierce resolve, her hands tightening into fists on the table, her focus absolute. "And he's in Houston, or wants us to think he is," she said, her tone heavy, her mind already mapping out the risks, the strategies, the traps that might be waiting. They moved fast, their movements urgent, their focus razor-sharp, their goal clear, find Miles, end Xeno, dismantle the machine he'd built. "He wants to be caught," Eleanor said, her voice low, her tone laced with realization, her eyes glinting with determination, her posture unyielding. "He thinks we'll flinch, that exposing this means admitting our failure, that we'll back off to save face." Lee grinned, a sharp, bitter smile, her voice low, her tone laced with a quiet challenge, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. "What if he's right?" she asked, her words heavy, her hands resting on the console, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp, watching Eleanor's reaction, testing her resolve. Eleanor didn't blink, didn't hesitate, her voice low, her tone steady, her eyes locked on Lee's, her determination unyielding. "We torch it ourselves, burn it down and rebuild from the ashes," she said, her words sharp, her posture rigid, her focus absolute. She turned to Torres and Bennett, her orders clear, her voice steady, her mind already mapping out the next steps, the next fight. "Strike team, silent, full tactical support," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her eyes glinting with determination, her resolve unbreakable. "Houston, 8 hours, blackout protocol, no leaks, no exceptions. We grab Miles, we end this." She nodded, her decision made, her focus absolute, her purpose clear. Bennett hesitated for a split second, her voice low, her tone laced with caution, her eyes searching Eleanor's, looking for a crack, a sign of doubt. "If he fights?" she asked, her words heavy, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, her posture rigid, her mind racing through the risks, the possibilities. Eleanor's voice was cold, her jaw tightening, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve, her posture unyielding, her determination absolute. "Then we end his game, once and for all," she said, her words sharp, her tone leaving no room for doubt, her focus unbreakable, her purpose clear. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Harper stood under the Capitol's soaring dome, the marble cool. Under her feet, the air thick with history, her right hand raised before a sea of cameras, their shutters clicking like a swarm of insects, the silence of the room heavy with gravity, not doubt, but respect, the kind earned through blood and truth. The Congressional Oversight Chamber was packed, the benches filled with lawmakers, aides, journalists, their faces a mix of shock and awe, their whispers fading as she took the oath. Behind her, the Justice Department's seal stood firm, its eagle carved in stone, flanked by officers in dress blues, their postures rigid, their faces unreadable, their presence a silent testament to the weight of the moment. Before her, 14 lawmakers sat at a long oak table, their expressions stunned but aligned, their hands resting on stacks of reports that laid bare the rot she'd uncovered, the machine she'd dismantled. She lowered her hand, her movements deliberate, her posture unyielding, and took the stand, her steps echoing in the vast chamber, leaning into the mic with a quiet authority that filled the room, her voice clear, steady, unshakable. "I'm Eleanor Harper, Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration," she began, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet resolve, her eyes sweeping the room, meeting every gaze without flinching. "I stand here not just as an officer of this agency, but as a woman who was framed by our own, targeted by a system that turned its back on the people it swore to protect. That arrest on a Colorado highway didn't just expose misconduct. It revealed a network rooted in greed, not ideals, a betrayal that ran deeper than any of us could have imagined. This wasn't rogue. It was a failure we let fester, a cancer we ignored for too long." She opened a thick file on the stand, her fingers steady, her movements deliberate, laying out Stronghold's corruption with surgical precision. Her voice steady as she detailed how federal tools, meant to protect, had been twisted to fuel drug money, to launder product, to erase lives. She named Victor Miles, Zeno's master, unchecked for years, his network a web that had ensnared dozens, his betrayal a scar on the agency's history. This wasn't just a system flaw, it was a betrayal of trust, a violation of every oath. "We take," she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with a quiet anger, her eyes glinting with determination, her posture unyielding. It claimed victims, Michael Carter, Lucas Chen, countless others whose names we may never know. For their silence we now speak, for their lives we now act. The chamber hushed, the silence thick, then erupted, not with politics or posturing, but with raw human reaction, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd, the weight of her words landing like stones in still water. Sweeps followed, swift and unrelenting, a wave of accountability that broke across the country. U.S. Marshals, auditors, DOJ teams hit 6 states, their movements coordinated, their focus absolute, cuffs locking on dozens, the sound of metal, clinking, echoing through precincts, through offices, through lives that had been untouchable for too long. Officers fled or caved under pressure. In Baton Rouge, a commander torched his files, the flames licking at years of lies before agents dragged him out, his hands cuffed, his face streaked with soot. In Phoenix, brass were cuffed mid-shift, their badges stripped, their authority gone. In an instant, their protests falling on deaf ears. The DEA seized 6 precincts, replaced leaders with hand-picked agents, froze data to prevent tampering, retrained staff under new protocols, their reforms sweeping, their purpose clear. The names from Lee's USB held, 73 confirmed, 75 indicted, 36 pled guilty within weeks, their confessions exposing drug channels, drop points, cartel ties that stretched from the border to the Midwest, their words a map of corruption that led to more arrests, more sweeps, more justice. Everyone implicated resigned, their careers in ashes, their legacies tainted. 6 took their own lives, unable to face the reckoning, their deaths a footnote in a larger story of accountability. Victor Miles was nabbed quietly in a Maryland storage room, a nerve center of servers, passports, and burner phones, US, Panamanian, Serbian. The documents used to move through borders like a ghost, their edges worn from use. He sat calm when agents breached the door, his gun untouched on the desk, his posture relaxed, like he'd been waiting for them, like he'd known this moment was coming. When Eleanor entered, her boots echoing on the concrete floor, her face streaked with dust from the raid, her eyes glinting with a fierce resolve, he smiled faintly, the expression tinged with resignation, his voice dry, his tone laced with a quiet amusement. "You got here, Director," he said, his words slow, his hands resting on the desk, his posture relaxed despite the cuffs waiting for him, the agents flanking him, their rifles up, their faces unreadable. "Took you long enough to catch up." She stared at him, her gaze hard, her jaw tightening, her voice low, her tone laced with a cold anger, her posture unyielding, her presence filling the room. "You built a machine that ate people, that chewed through lives, all while hiding. Behind an oath you swore to uphold," she said, her words sharp, her eyes locked on his, watching for a reaction, a crack in his calm, finding none. He smirked, the expression bitter, his eyes darkening, his voice low, his tone laced with a quiet defiance, his hands steady despite the weight of his crimes. "I built a reflection, a mirror of what was already there," he said, his words heavy, his posture unchanged, his gaze unflinching, meeting hers without fear. "You think you're clean, Director? You think the system you serve isn't just as broken?" Eleanor didn't bite, didn't let his words shake her, her focus absolute, her resolve unyielding, her voice steady as she crossed to his desk. Her movements deliberate, her hands steady as she took his keys, the metal cold against her skin, unlocking his stash, his plans, his past, the evidence spilling out like a confession. "Black site transport now," she said to the agents, her tone sharp, her orders clear, her eyes flicking to them, watching as they moved to comply, their movements swift, their focus absolute. "Full isolation, no contact, no exceptions." They cuffed him, their movements quick, efficient, checking him for devices, for weapons, for anything that could be a threat, their hands steady despite the tension in the air. Miles stood, slow, deliberate, glancing back at Eleanor as they led him out, his voice low, his tone laced with a quiet warning, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "It'll outlive you, you know," he said, his words heavy, his posture unchanged, his calm unbroken despite the cuffs, the agents, the end of his game. "The machine, the system, it always does." "Not yours," Eleanor said, her voice steady, her tone laced with determination, her eyes locked on his, her posture unyielding, her resolve absolute. "Not the one we're fixing, the one we're building anew." He said nothing, his smirk fading, his eyes darkening as the door shut behind him, the sound final, the lock clicking into place with a heavy thud. The corridor outside was dim, the lights soft, the reflections faint on the polished floors, the air cool against her skin as she walked alone, her steps steady, her posture unyielding. There were no cheers, no pomp, no celebration waiting for her, and she didn't need it, didn't want it. What came next wasn't a win, it was rebuilding, a harder fight, a longer one, the kind that demanded more than a single victory, the kind that demanded everything she had. The DEA gutted Zeno, its codes erased, its servers wiped, its systems rebuilt under public scrutiny, the process live-streamed to ensure transparency, to prove to the public that the rot was gone. No override remained, no hidden protocols, no ghost IDs. A new platform rose in its place, transparent, accountable, built by whistleblowers like Lee, by agents who'd seen the cost of silence, their hands steady as they coded, their purpose clear. It ensured no record, no transfer, could slip through the cracks, no evidence could vanish without a trace, no officer could hide behind a badge. It demanded accountability, made it non-negotiable, its safeguards ironclad, its purpose pure. Eleanor named the new system Carter, after Michael Carter, the young man whose death had been the first thread she'd pulled, the first crack in the machine she'd dismantled. She added a note to the system's documentation, her words simple, her tone heavy with meaning. His name mattered. Let it endure. The system launched with federal sync, its rollout nationwide, its impact immediate. Cases reopened, evidence re-examined, officers flagged for review. The truth no longer buried, the past no longer silent. Bennett, months later, led the Office of Internal Oversight, a new division created to hunt violations like crimes. Her authority absolute, her purpose clear, her audits sweeping through agencies like a storm, clearing old corruption, reviving lost cases, ensuring the system stayed clean. At her oath ceremony, she held Carter's file in her hands, her silence louder than any speech, her posture unyielding, her resolve a promise to those who'd been failed, a promise she intended to keep. Eleanor visited the detention center later, not as a symbol of victory, but as a witness to justice. Her steps steady as she walked through the sterile halls, the air cold, the lights harsh, the sound of her boots echoing off the concrete walls. She stood before Daniels and Brooks, separated by thick glass, her voice steady, her tone low, her eyes meeting theirs without flinching, her posture unyielding, her presence a reminder of their failure. Your network's ash, burned to the ground, she said, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet triumph, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The cartels you fed, the ones you protected, they're cut off, their roots exposed, their drops raided. Your allies, flipped or gone, their names in our files, their deals on record, their freedom traded for leniency. Miles is processed, locked down, his machine dismantled. Zeno's not off. It's erased, wiped from every server, every backup, every trace gone. She didn't shout, didn't raise her voice, just met their eyes, letting the silence hit harder than any words. Letting the truth sink in, letting them feel the weight of their defeat. No one's coming for you, she said, her words heavy, her tone final, her eyes glinting with determination, her posture unyielding. Brooks looked away, his face empty, his defiance gone, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his reality, his silence a confession of its own. Daniels nodded, broken, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling in his cuffs, his voice silent, his fight over. Their silence dissolved, the last of their resistance crumbling under the weight of her words, the truth she'd brought to light. She left them behind the glass, her steps steady, her purpose clear, her resolve unbroken, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud, the sound final, the chapter closed. Outside, cameras caught her as she exited the detention center, their lenses trained on her, their shutters clicking. But there was no frenzy, no swarm of reporters shouting questions, no chaos to navigate. She walked from a truth, unburdened, her posture unyielding, her face calm, her eyes steady, her presence a quiet force that spoke louder than any headline. The footage aired that night, a closing note on a story that had gripped the nation. A story of corruption, of justice, of a woman who'd refused to break,
who'd rebuilt what had been broken, who'd made sure the truth endured. Months later, sunlight flooded the DEA's training center in Quantico, warming the stone floors where new recruits stood sharp in their uniforms, their postures rigid,
their faces eager, their eyes bright with purpose, the air thick with the smell of polished wood and fresh paint. The space was remade, not for show, but for purpose. Its walls stripped of old plaques, its halls cleared of old ghosts, its mission redefined under Eleanor's leadership, its foundation stronger than ever. Under a new seal carved into the wall: accountability, oversight, integrity. Eleanor took the podium, no notes in her hands, just the truth in her heart. Her voice steady, her tone clear, her presence filling the room, her eyes sweeping over the recruits, meeting every gaze. Without flinching. "I'm not here to greet you, not here to welcome you with empty words," she said, her words sharp, her tone laced with a quiet resolve, her posture unyielding, her focus absolute. "I'm here to remind you, this agency doesn't give you power. It demands duty, demands sacrifice, demands that you hold yourself to a standard higher than any badge can confer. Your badge puts you under the law's weight, not above it, not beside it." Her eyes swept the room, not to scare, but to anchor, to ground them in the reality of the work ahead, to remind them of the cost of failure, the price of silence. "We rebuilt this place not to shine, not to look good in headlines, but to stand firm, to endure," she said, her words heavy, her tone laced with determination, her hands steady on the podium, her posture rigid, her resolve unyielding. "Unchecked power, buried reports, quiet immunity, that's gone, erased, burned out of our systems, our culture, our mission. If you're here for the right reasons, if you're here to serve, to protect, to uphold the law, this agency will shield you, support you, stand with you. If not, if you're here for yourself, for power, for profit, it will burn you, expose you, hold you accountable. No exceptions, no excuses." No cheers came, none were needed, none were expected. The weight of her words enough, the truth of her fight enough, the quiet in the room a testament to the impact of her message. A screen glowed behind her, its images stark, simple, powerful. Her nephew in class, safe now, smiling at his desk, his life untouched by the threats that had loomed. Precincts cleaned, their new teams standing tall, their badges gleaming under. New leadership, the untouchable, cuffed, their heads bowed, their power stripped. Bennett at a Carter terminal, launching it nationwide, her face calm, her purpose clear. Not a win, but proof, clean, real, enduring. Eleanor left the stage, her steps steady, her posture unyielding. No ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet strength of a woman who'd fought and won, who'd rebuilt what had been broken, who'd made sure the truth endured. She walked the halls of the center, free of ghosts, alive with purpose, the air lighter, the shadows gone, the future clear. Agents, staff, new recruits nodded as she passed. Not in awe, but in respect. Their eyes meeting hers, their postures straight, their purpose aligned with hers. Their commitment, a silent promise to uphold what she'd fought for. In her office, the city view held steady through the window, the Potomac glinting under the sun. The world beyond it changed, its scars healing, its systems stronger, its truth no longer buried. Her desk was clear, the files gone, the cases closed, the work ahead waiting, her hands steady, her mind sharp, her purpose clear. A knock came, soft but firm. A staffer entering with a sealed file, nodding once before leaving, her presence brief, her message clear. Eleanor opened it, her fingers steady, the paper crisp, an audit report confirming compliance, the reforms working, the systems holding, the truth owed to the public now delivered, the agency's foundation stronger than ever. Outside, Washington hummed under a bright sky, the city alive, its rhythm steady, its people moving through their lives with a quiet resilience, their faith in justice restored, their trust in the system rebuilt. Eleanor breathed deep, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in months, her body no longer braced for war, her mind no longer racing through threats, her heart no longer heavy with the weight of what she'd uncovered. The shadows had faded, the enemies gone, the machine dead, the trust rebuilt. She looked out at the city, not for victory, not for recognition, but for proof. Justice wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, wasn't a headline. It was relentless, steady, unbroken, a truth that endured, a promise that held. It was done, truly done, and she was ready for whatever came next. I hope you enjoyed this story, a journey through corruption, justice, and rebuilding, a tale of what happens when one woman refuses to break, refuses to let the truth be buried. Share it with friends, let them feel the weight of Eleanor's fight, and subscribe for more stories that cut to the heart of what matters. Here are 2 hand-picked stories you'll love, tales of resilience and truth just waiting for you. Have a great day, and thank you for being here.